Nobody in Albuquerque took Saul Goodman seriously. At least, nobody with real power. While Saul's face flashed on every billboard, promising to fight for you, men like Juan Bolsa and the cartel's lieutenants laughed behind closed doors. That clown couldn't outmaneuver a parking ticket, let alone our operation, they told themselves, sipping tequila in corner booths and plotting their next moves. To the cartel, Saul was an afterthought, a local ambulance chaser, good for cleaning up minor messes but out of his league when the stakes involved real prison time or real retribution. That's what made him the perfect target. With Walter White now deep in the game and the cartel closing in, the lieutenants saw a chance to finally crush their upstart rival and prove the DEA couldn't shield him forever. Their chosen weapon wasn't a gun or a hitman, it was the courts, paperwork, old warrants, threats of seized assets, and witness tampering. If Walter fell, Saul would fall with him. And when Saul went up against their lawyers and rigged judges, he'd go down hard. So they pressed. Phone calls at midnight. "We know where you live, Goodman." Warning letters, and one day a cartel emissary waiting for him outside his gaudy office, a silent promise that legal niceties only went so far. Even Walter, used to having the answers, couldn't hide his fear when Saul spelled out the details. "There's no way out this time, Walt. They've got us boxed in on every side." But behind Saul's jittery chatter and cheap suits, something dangerous flickered. Still smiling, still cracking jokes, but never showing the cards he was about to play. The cartel's plan unfolded with surgical precision. They had money, connections, and judges who owed them favors scattered across 3 states. What did Saul Goodman have? A strip mall office decorated like a bachelor pad, and a secretary who answered phones between manicures. The lieutenants gathered in a back room at Los Polos Hermanos, spreading documents across the table like generals planning a siege. Old arrest warrants for Jesse Pinkman. Financial records showing suspicious cash flows through the car wash. Testimony from dealers willing to swear they'd seen Walter White coordinating distribution networks. Everything tied together with legal ribbon, ready to present to a grand jury. "Goodman won't see it coming," one lieutenant said, lighting a cigarette. "He'll walk into court thinking he can charm the judge with his cheap suit and cheaper jokes. By the time he realizes we've stacked the deck, it'll be too late." The others nodded, already savoring the victory. They'd watched Saul operate for months, all bluster and theatrics, the kind of lawyer who got clients off on technicalities because he couldn't win on facts. He was good at his job, sure, but only because his job involved defending small-time criminals in small-time cases. This wasn't small-time anymore. Meanwhile, Saul played his part perfectly. He showed up to preliminary hearings looking nervous, fumbling with papers, cracking inappropriate jokes that made the prosecutors smirk. "Your Honor, I think there's been a misunderstanding," he'd say, adjusting his garish tie. "My client is a simple chemistry teacher who—" The judge would cut him off. The cartel's lawyers would object before he finished sentences. Everything appeared to be going exactly as planned. Walter grew increasingly desperate, pacing Saul's office and demanding answers. "They're going to put us away for life. What's your strategy? What are you doing?" "Relax, Walt," Saul would say, feet up on his desk, spinning a pen between his fingers. "I've got this under control." But his confidence seemed hollow, like a man whistling past a graveyard. Even Jesse questioned whether they'd picked the right lawyer. "Mr. White, maybe we need someone serious, someone from a real firm. Saul's getting destroyed in there." The cartel watched it all unfold with satisfaction. They'd planted evidence that Saul couldn't explain away. They'd convinced a key witness to flip someone who could place Walter at a meeting with distributors. They'd even arranged for a judge known to throw the book at drug cases, a man whose brother had been lost to substance issues and who had zero tolerance for anyone connected to the trade. Every angle covered, every escape route blocked. In the courthouse hallways, the cartel's lawyers exchanged knowing looks with their clients. "Goodman's drowning," one whispered. "He knows it. Look at him sweating." And Saul did look worried, constantly mopping his forehead with a handkerchief, taking calls in the corridor that seemed to bring worse news with each ring. The preliminary hearings went badly. Motions to dismiss were denied. Evidence was ruled admissible. The judge set a trial date and made it clear he expected this case to proceed swiftly. Everything pointed toward a guilty verdict that would send Walter White to prison for decades and destroy Saul's career in the process. What the cartel didn't see, what they couldn't see, because they'd already decided Saul was beneath their notice, was that every fumbled paper, every nervous gesture, every failed motion was part of a performance. Behind the cheap suit and panicked expressions, Saul Goodman was studying the board, counting the pieces, and preparing a move that would flip the entire game. The courtroom was packed on the day everything changed. Cartel representatives sat in the back rows, confident and calm. Their lawyers shuffled papers with barely concealed smiles. The judge entered, gavelled the room to order, and the prosecution began presenting their case against Walter White and his associates. Evidence was damning. Testimony was precise. The cartel's legal team had built a fortress, and Saul Goodman appeared to be standing outside it with nothing but a plastic spoon. Then Saul stood up. "Your Honor," he began, his voice suddenly stripped of its usual nervous energy. "Before we proceed further, I need to bring to the court's attention a rather significant problem with the evidence being presented today." The prosecutor waved dismissively, already preparing to object, but the judge, curious despite himself, gestured for Saul to continue. Saul pulled out a folder, thick with documents that no one had seen him prepare. "The prosecution's star witness, the gentleman who claims to have seen my client coordinating drug distribution, gave his testimony under circumstances that violate federal witness protection protocols. Specifically, he was interviewed without proper legal counsel present, and more importantly, he was interviewed by an agent who was later removed from the DEA for evidence tampering in an unrelated case." The courtroom went silent. The prosecutor stood, objecting, but Saul was already moving to his next point. "Furthermore, Your Honor, the financial records being used to establish my client's alleged criminal enterprise were obtained through a warrant signed by Judge Harold Watkins of the 2nd District. I'm sure the prosecution remembers Judge Watkins. He was disbarred last month for accepting bribes to sign warrants without proper cause. Every warrant he signed in the past 3 years is currently under review, including the one used to seize these financial documents." The cartel's lead lawyer leaned forward, whispering urgently to his assistant. This wasn't public knowledge yet. How did Goodman know? But Saul wasn't finished. He approached the bench, handing documents directly to the judge. "I've also discovered that the chain of custody for the physical evidence, specifically the methamphetamine samples being used to establish purity and link my client to production, was broken on 3 separate occasions. The evidence was stored in a facility that lost its certification 2 months ago but continued operating anyway. Under federal law, any evidence with a compromised chain of custody is inadmissible." The prosecutor was on his feet now, face red, demanding to review the documents. The judge was reading carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. In the back of the courtroom, the cartel representatives were no longer smiling. Their carefully constructed case was collapsing in real time. Saul turned to face the prosecution directly. "And here's the beautiful part, Your Honor. When the DEA initially arrested the witnesses who are now testifying against my client, they failed to read them their rights for approximately 47 minutes. I have body camera footage, timestamps, and sworn affidavits from 3 officers who were present. Every statement made during that time is inadmissible. Every piece of evidence obtained as a result of those statements is fruit of the poisonous tree." The term hung in the air like a death sentence for the prosecution's case. Fruit of the poisonous tree evidence obtained illegally that contaminates everything that follows. It was the nuclear option of legal defense, and Saul had just detonated it in the middle of the courtroom. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing his temples. "Counselor, are you telling me that effectively all of the prosecution's evidence is compromised?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, Your Honor." Saul's voice was calm, professional, almost gentle. "And I'm formally moving to have all charges against my client dismissed with prejudice." The cartel's lawyers scrambled, trying to salvage something, anything, but it was too late. Saul had found every crack in their fortress and systematically demolished it with nothing but paperwork and legal procedure. The clown they'd dismissed as harmless had just made their entire case disappear. The judge's gavel came down like thunder. Motion granted. All charges dismissed with prejudice. The words echoed through the courtroom, final and absolute, with prejudice meaning the prosecution couldn't refile, couldn't try again, couldn't salvage anything from the wreckage of their case. It was over. Completely, devastatingly over. The cartel representatives sat frozen in their seats, unable to process what had just happened. Their fortress of evidence, their carefully corrupted witnesses, their bought judges and planted documents, all of it reduced to nothing by a lawyer they'd dismissed as a joke. The lead attorney gathered his papers with shaking hands, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. There was nothing left to say. Saul Goodman had systematically dismantled everything they'd built, and he'd done it using nothing but the law itself. Outside the courthouse, Walter White stood in the sunlight, hardly believing they were free. Jesse was already celebrating, whooping and punching the air, but Walter just stared at Saul with a new understanding. This wasn't the bumbling ambulance chaser who advertised on bus benches and wore tacky suits. This was something else entirely, a predator who'd learned to use the legal system as his weapon, someone who could destroy enemies without firing a single shot. "How did you know?" Walter finally asked. "About the warrants, the chain of custody, the witness interviews, how did you know all of that?" Saul adjusted his tie, that familiar smirk returning to his face. "Walt, you think I spend my days just defending idiots who got caught with an ounce in their glove box? I've been studying this game for 20 years. Every judge, every prosecutor, every cop in this city, I know their histories, their mistakes, their dirty little secrets. The cartel thought they could beat me with paperwork and procedure. That's my home turf. They brought a knife to a gunfight, except the gun was a law degree and a filing cabinet. Within days, the cartel reached out. Not with threats this time, but with a proposal. A meeting, terms of negotiation. The message came through intermediaries, carefully worded, almost respectful. They wanted to discuss how to move forward, how to avoid future conflicts, how to establish boundaries that both parties could respect. It was surrender dressed up as diplomacy, and everyone knew it. Saul took the meeting in a restaurant, sitting across from men who'd wanted him destroyed just a week earlier. He ordered a meal, made small talk, and laid out his terms with the casual confidence of someone who held all the cards. Walter's operation would continue without interference. No more legal traps. No more threats. In exchange, they'd stay out of certain territories and avoid stepping on certain toes. The cartel representatives nodded, agreed, and left knowing they'd been outplayed by someone they'd never seen coming. The lesson spread through Albuquerque's criminal underworld like wildfire. Saul Goodman wasn't just a lawyer, he was untouchable. He'd beaten the cartel without throwing a punch, without firing a weapon, without getting his hands dirty. He'd proven that in a world obsessed with violence and intimidation, sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who knows how to read a contract and spot a procedural error. Walter watched it all unfold with a mixture of admiration and unease. He'd built an empire on chemistry and calculated risks, but Saul had just demonstrated something even more valuable, the power to make problems disappear using nothing but paperwork and loopholes. In the criminal world, where everyone spoke the language of threats and violence, Saul Goodman had shown that bureaucracy could be deadlier than bullets. The cartel had laughed at Walter White's lawyer, but Saul Goodman had the last laugh, and he'd earned it without ever raising his voice. The story of Saul Goodman's courtroom massacre spread through Albuquerque's underworld like a legend that grew with each retelling. Dealers whispered about it in back alleys. Distributors discussed it over drinks in dimly lit bars. Even rival cartels, operating hundreds of miles away, heard about the lawyer who'd dismantled a prosecution so thoroughly that the judge had apologized to the defense before dismissing the case. Within weeks, Saul's phone never stopped ringing. Criminals who'd never considered hiring him before were suddenly lining up outside his strip mall office, clutching charges ranging from possession to money laundering, all hoping he could work the same magic for them. But Saul didn't take every case. He'd learned something valuable from his battle with the cartel, that reputation matters more than volume, and that turning away clients who couldn't afford his new rates only made him more desirable to those who could. His fees tripled overnight, then tripled again. He upgraded his office, hired additional staff, and began selecting cases based not on how much money they brought in, but on how much they would enhance his growing mythology. Every victory, every technicality exploited, every time he made evidence disappear through procedural sorcery, it added another layer to the legend of Saul Goodman. Walter watched the transformation with mixed emotions. On one hand, he was grateful to have survived what should have been an insurmountable legal crisis. On the other hand, he realized he now had a partner who understood his own value and wouldn't be easily controlled or dismissed. Saul no longer took midnight calls with panicked questions. He scheduled appointments. He dictated terms. The dynamic had shifted, and Walter understood that the man who'd saved him could just as easily destroy him if their interests ever diverged. Jesse noticed the change too. "Yo, Mr. White, Saul's different now. He's not scared anymore. Used to be, we could pressure him into stuff. Now he looks at us like we're the ones who need him, which, we kinda do. It was an uncomfortable truth that Walter couldn't deny. They'd all benefited from Saul's victory, but it had also revealed a fundamental reality about their operation. The lawyer was the most dangerous person in the room, and he didn't even need a weapon. The cartel, for their part, never made another move against Walter's operation. They honored the negotiated terms, stayed out of agreed-upon territories, and treated Saul Goodman with the kind of wary respect usually reserved for men who'd killed their way to power. But Saul hadn't killed anyone. He'd simply understood the game better than they did understood, that in a world governed by laws, the person who knows how to manipulate those laws holds ultimate power. Years later, when everything had fallen apart and Walter's empire lay in ruins, when bodies were buried and families were destroyed, when the consequences of the drug trade had exacted their terrible price, one fact remained undisputed. Saul Goodman had beaten the cartel in court using nothing but paperwork and knowledge of the legal system. He'd proven that in the modern criminal world, the most valuable weapon isn't a gun or a knife, or even a brilliant chemist's formula. It's information, procedure, and the ability to find cracks in the system that everyone else overlooks. The lesson resonated far beyond that single courtroom victory. In a business built on violence and intimidation, Saul Goodman had demonstrated that sometimes the quietest voice in the room, the one that knows every loophole, every technicality, every judge's weakness, is the one that wins. The cartel had laughed at Walter White's lawyer, but when the dust settled and the gavel came down, Saul Goodman was the only one still smiling. The courtroom victory became the defining moment of Saul Goodman's career, but it also marked the beginning of his descent into a world from which there would be no escape. In the months and years that followed, as Walter White's empire expanded and the body count rose, Saul found himself trapped by his own success. He'd proven he could outsmart the cartel, could dismantle prosecutions, could make the impossible happen through legal wizardry. And that reputation meant he couldn't walk away even when he wanted to. Every criminal in the Southwest knew his name now. They knew what he'd done, how he'd turned certain defeat into total victory using nothing but paperwork and procedure. They came to him with increasingly dangerous problems, increasingly violent clients, increasingly desperate situations that required increasingly questionable solutions. Saul couldn't refuse them without losing the reputation that protected him. The legend he'd built had become his prison. Late at night, alone in his office, surrounded by case files and cash payments, Saul sometimes wondered if the cartel had actually lost that day in court. They'd walked away, bruised but alive, able to continue their operations with a measure of respect for the lawyer who'd beaten them. But Saul? He'd won the battle and lost something far more valuable, the ability to choose his own path. He was bound to Walter White now, bound to the criminal underworld, bound by the very skills that had made him indispensable. The phone calls came at all hours. Fix this problem, make this evidence disappear, find a loophole, intimidate a witness. Each request pulled him deeper into the machine, until he couldn't see daylight anymore. The strip mall office that had once seemed like a kingdom now felt like a cell, decorated with garish colors and false confidence. Saul Goodman had become exactly what he'd always pretended to be, a criminal lawyer in both senses of the term. Walter noticed the change, but said nothing. To him, Saul was a tool, a necessary component of the operation, valuable precisely because he was so good at what he did. The human cost didn't register. Jesse saw it more clearly the way Saul's jokes became more forced, the way his eyes darted toward exits during meetings, the way he jumped at unexpected sounds. This was a man who'd won everything and realized too late that victory had condemned him. The cartel had laughed at Saul Goodman, then learned to fear him, then learned to use him. In the end, they'd gotten exactly what they wanted without firing a shot or winning a case. They'd turned the lawyer into another piece on the board, another asset to be leveraged, another life consumed by the game. Saul had proven that brains could beat bullets, that legal knowledge could overcome violence, that the system could be manipulated by someone smart enough to see its weaknesses. But he'd also proven something darker, that in the criminal world, being too good at what you do doesn't set you free. It chains you to the very people and systems you thought you were outsmarting. The cartel had lost a court case but won a war of attrition, because the lawyer who defeated them was now permanently entangled in the web they'd helped weave. Years later, when everything collapsed and Saul was forced to run, to abandon his identity and live as a nobody in a nowhere town, he would look back on that courtroom triumph as the moment his fate was sealed. He'd turned the tables on the cartel, saved Walter White, and built a reputation that made him untouchable. And in doing so, he'd destroyed any chance of being anything other than what he'd become. The cartel had laughed at Walter White's lawyer, but Saul Goodman had the last laugh, even if that laugh echoed from a prison of his own making. The final irony of Saul Goodman's courtroom masterpiece only became clear years later, when everything had collapsed and he was living under a new name in a colorless town, managing a Cinnabon in a shopping mall and jumping at shadows. Gene Takavic, as he was now called, would sometimes replay that moment in his mind, the judge's gavel coming down, the cartel's lawyers gathering their papers in defeat, Walter White walking free into the sunlight. At the time, it had felt like the greatest victory of his career. Now, with the benefit of hindsight and the weight of consequences, he understood it differently. That courtroom victory had been the beginning of the end, not just for him, but for everyone involved. By proving he could outsmart the cartel, by demonstrating that legal knowledge could defeat criminal organizations, by becoming the lawyer who made impossible problems disappear, he'd painted a target on his own back that would never fade. Every criminal in the Southwest wanted him. Every desperate situation required his expertise. Every moral line he'd once hesitated to cross became easier to step over, then leap across, then forget entirely. The Walter White he'd saved that day in court had gone on to build an empire that destroyed families, ended lives, and left a trail of bodies across New Mexico. And Saul had been there every step of the way, enabling it, profiting from it, becoming complicit in horrors he'd never imagined when he first passed the bar exam. The courtroom victory over the cartel had proven that brains could beat bullets, but it had also proven that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't the one that kills you fastest, but the one that keeps you alive long enough to destroy yourself slowly. In his new life as Gene, working the morning shift and avoiding eye contact with customers, Saul had plenty of time to think about what he'd won and what he'd lost. He'd beaten the cartel in court, saved his client, built a reputation that made him untouchable. And in return, he'd lost his identity, his freedom, his ability to practice law, and any chance of being the person he'd once hoped to become. The man who'd walked into that courthouse confident and clever had never really walked out. Something else had emerged, something that wore his face but had sold its soul one legal technicality at a time. The lesson, he now understood, wasn't the one everyone else had taken from that day. The criminal world had learned that Saul Goodman could outwit anyone, that legal knowledge was a weapon, that the right lawyer could make justice disappear. But the real lesson was darker and more personal. Winning doesn't always mean victory, and sometimes the most dangerous trap is the one you build for yourself out of your own talents. The cartel had laughed at Walter White's lawyer, then learned to fear him, then learned to use him, and finally didn't need to destroy him because he'd destroyed himself. Every victory had been a step deeper into darkness. Every case won had been another piece of his humanity sold. Every legal triumph had been another nail in the coffin of the person he might have been. Now, flipping cinnamon rolls in Nebraska and living in fear of being recognized, Saul Goodman understood the truth that had been hidden in that courtroom all along.